Chapter 6. Modern History. Meiji, Taisho, Early Showa. 54. The Boshin War. The last shogun surrendered to the restoration forces in Edo on May 3, 1868. The military leaders of the various domains, however, were split into two camps. One camp was composed of forces from Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and other domains who supported the imperial cause. Standing opposed to them, under the leadership of the lord of Aizu domain, was a league that was determined to resist the imperial regime. Once Wakamatsu Castle of the Aizu domain was captured, the resistance in the north collapsed. Daimyo who surrendered were placed under house arrest. Their territories were split up and dramatically reduced in size. The series of battles that lasted over a period of 17 months came to be known as the Boshin War. Some 8,200 were killed during this war, and another 5,000 were wounded. The Meiji Restoration was, therefore, not entirely a bloodless coup d'etat. However, it might have been much bloodier if Yoshinobu, the last shogun, had resisted for a longer period of time. 55. The Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration, Meiji Ishin, began with a coup on January 3, 1868. Anti-shogunate forces, led by the southern domains of Satsuma and Choshu, seized the imperial palace in Kyoto. They announced that the shogun had returned political power to the emperor. The young Emperor Meiji was going to rule the country. But restoration did not take place overnight. It took many years to create a new kind of government. A starting point for this historical process was the Charter Oath of April of that same year. This document was designed to calm fears of those domains which did not participate in the restoration movement. It promised that those domains would be included in decision-making. It stated clearly that all matters shall be decided by public discussion. Although it did not give details, it said that deliberative councils would be part of the government. This implied that the feudal Bakuhan system was abolished. The former shogunal capital, Edo, was renamed Tokyo, literally Eastern Capital. It was designated as the new national capital city. The domains were eventually transformed into prefectures, administered by governors. The central government took over responsibility for education and defense. To do this, it needed to raise money. It carried out land surveys in 1873 to determine the value of each piece of land. It then introduced a new system of land taxes to raise money to run the government. Not surprisingly, there was resistance in the countryside. 56. The Satsuma Rebellion. Satsuma hero Saigo Takamori commanded the army that restored the emperor to sovereignty in 1868. When the Iwakura mission departed for the west, Saigo remained behind in control of the imperial army. While the mission was abroad, the new central government decided to conquer Korea. Before it could act, Iwakura and the other members of the mission returned. They had broader experience with Western nations and realized what Japan needed to do before it began any foreign adventures. The plans for invading Korea were set aside. Saigo quit the new government and returned to his home in Satsuma, now Kagoshima Prefecture. Other unhappy former samurai quit their posts and returned to Satsuma with Saigo. They eventually persuaded him to lead a revolt against the Tokyo government. He led a rebellion that lasted from January 29th to September 24th, 1877. Yamagata Aritomo, architect of the modern Japanese army, led the government forces against the rebel forces. It took the central government's forces more than half a year to defeat the Satsuma forces, mobilizing 65,000 men from its own police force and recruiting former samurai from other domains. The Satsuma rebellion ended in defeat for the rebels, and Saigo committed suicide. The rebellion was the final major military challenge to the centralization of the Meiji government. But Saigo's nationalist dream of expansion would be taken up by a younger generation. 57. The campaign against Buddhism. Following the Meiji Restoration, there was a backlash against Buddhism. This was partly because Buddhism had played a significant role in supporting the Tokugawa shogunate. Buddhist temples were involved in registration of the common people. Some priests and temples were accused of corruption. In addition to this, Buddhism and Shinto had become closely intertwined. They were so tied together that almost every temple included a Shinto shrine. In most cases, the Buddhists had the advantage in these relations. Restoration leaders worked with Shinto intellectuals to form the basis for the independence and supremacy of the imperial house. After the emperor was officially restored to power, some reformers called for a separation of the two religions, Shinbutsu Bunri. Kokugaku is thought to have provided the reasons for doing this. National learning scholars promoted the importance of national deities and criticized Buddhism for denying the true spirit of the Japanese people. Some extremists were angry at the power of Buddhist groups. Using the slogan Haibutsu Kishaku, eradicate Buddhism, they destroyed temples and religious objects. When this excessive reaction to Buddhism came to an end, the two religions were completely separated. Even the deity Hachiman, who had been transformed into a Buddhist bodhisattva, reverted to being the Shinto god of war. 58. Slogans for a new era. The new leadership used several slogans to express their ideas. During the 1850s and early 1860s, many leaders called for expelling foreigners, joi, to avoid contamination from foreign ideas. But by the end of the 1860s, the Meiji leaders were more open to the West, to both Western people and Western ideas and technologies. Some preferred Wakon Yosai, Japanese spirit, Western knowledge, as a way to balance tradition with technology. Promoting Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment, the Meiji elite wanted to educate the common population about Western civilization. This included everything from personal appearance to sports to technology. The government promoted civilization and enlightenment in many ways. It used laws and regulations. It sent students abroad and brought foreign experts, Oyatoi Gaikokujin, to Japan. It commissioned translations of Western classics. As an example of the regulations, in the Sanpatsu Datto Rei, the government made wearing of swords optional, datto, and eliminated top knots, chonmage, in 1871, encouraging shorter Western haircuts for men. Western clothing became mandatory for government bureaucrats a year later. The government also supported more substantive efforts, beginning with the Iwakura Mission. 59. The Iwakura Mission. In an effort to gain superior Western technology, during the Tokugawa period, the Bakufu, as well as Satsuma and Choshu, had sent students to study in Europe. The most important venture abroad, however, was the Iwakura Mission of 1871 through 1873. Some of the most powerful figures in the new government, Iwakura Tomomi, Okubo Toshimichi, Kido Takayoshi, and Ito Hirobumi, spent 22 months traveling in the United States and Europe. They observed a wide range of institutions and practices, including factories, schools, and legislatures. They returned to Japan deeply impressed by the economic power of modern industry and by the social power of educated citizens. They also returned with the impression that Western superiority in many fields was relatively new. Therefore, rather than focusing just on building military defenses, they believed that Japan should modernize first. Their combined experience motivated the introduction of Western institutions, such as universities, banks, post offices, and police forces. Overall, the Iwakura mission recognized that the success of the nation would depend on education and unification. In order to establish qualifications for releasing Japan from the unequal treaties, they would have to modernize Japan. Japan would need to change its education, its legal system, and its industry. It would also have to establish representational institutions to build consensus. 60. Ito Hirobumi charts a new course. The first phase of Meiji political change occurred during the 1870s. The Bakuhan political structure was dismantled one element at a time. During the 1880s, a new structure emerged. The Charter Oath of 1868 mentioned the establishment of deliberative councils to publicly discuss issues. But for a long period, no such assemblies materialized. Eventually, the new leadership had the emperor order the forming of a constitution and the holding of elections for a parliament in 1890. The responsibility for studying the government institutions of other countries in preparation for creating this constitution was given to a commission headed by Ito Hirobumi. In 1882, Ito traveled to Europe. He consulted with Japan's ministers to London and Berlin, and with constitutional scholars in Germany. Upon returning to Japan, Ito was determined to protect the imperial institution. First, Ito's commission formalized a division between the emperor and commoners by creating a new peerage in 1884. A total of 507 former daimyo joined 137 court nobles to form a new peerage as kazoku, peers. This new system became the House of Peers, a buffer for the monarchy. Above this, and entirely separate, were those who were related to the emperor by blood. To prevent the emperor from assuming public responsibility for government, in 1885, a new cabinet system was announced. This system protected the emperor from the realm of politics through the bureaucracy of the imperial household. The political activity was delegated to an appointed prime minister and various ministries under him. Ito himself became the first prime minister in that same year. 61. The People's Rights Movement. The elite debated who would participate in the new government and the elected assemblies. Meanwhile, commoners were not passively waiting for someone to respond to their immediate needs. In the 1880s, local groups throughout the country began trying to gain a voice in politics. These independent groups are referred to as the People's Rights Movement, Jiyu Minken Undo. Among the more important was a revolt of between 5,000 and 10,000 middle and lower-ranking farmers in Saitama Prefecture. In the Chichibu incident, these farmers rose up in protest over problems they faced in the countryside. Suffering under new legal and tax structures, these farmers protested with hopes of some alleviation of their circumstances. They briefly succeeded with hunting rifles, bamboo spears, and wooden cannon in holding off local militias. But in the end, there were no match for government troops. 4,000 were rounded up and 7 leaders were executed. No help came for their burdensome debts and taxation. The People's Rights Movement was not limited to the poor and indebted. Former samurai, people of medium income, merchants, and others who hoped for a new political order that might respond to their needs formed political parties. Okuma Shigenobu, 1838 to 1922, and Itagaki Taisuke, 1837 to 1919, formed 2 of the earlier and more significant parties. All of these parties were at least partially interested in one thing. They wanted to participate in national and local decision-making. In practical terms, This meant they believed that a constitution and some form of system of representation were necessary. 62. Constitution 1889. The draft constitution submitted by the Ito Commission was made official by imperial promulgation on February 11, 1889. That day became National Foundation Day, Kenkoku Kinen no Hi. The new constitution took the imperial institution as the foundation of government, but it gave decision-making power to a newly established national diet, Kokkai. The first national election under the Meiji Constitution was carried out in July 1890. In order to prevent the government from falling into the hands of radicals, the election law limited the right to vote to males who paid a direct national tax of more than 15 yen. Land taxes in that year provided 60% of government revenues. This meant that those who owned land would be strongly represented within the electorate. Eligible voters numbered some 450,000 males out of a total population of roughly 40 million men and women. Most of the candidates echoed the long-standing popular demands for maintaining national dignity and objections to treaty reforms. Over the next 2 decades, Japan gained recognition and equal status with other nations in trade and diplomacy. In 1905, the British representation in Tokyo became a full-fledged embassy, and other major powers quickly followed suit. By the end of the Meiji period, Japan's international status was firmly established. 63. The Sino-Japanese War. After the Meiji Restoration, Japan and China began arguing over their respective interests in Korea. Korea had been a tributary state of China for centuries. However, in 1876, a Japanese naval expedition brought Korea to accept the Kangwa Treaty. This treaty treated Korea as independent of China. Therefore, Korea and Japan could trade freely with one another, without consideration of China's interests. China and Japan made an agreement in 1885. If troops from abroad were ever needed in Korea, Chinese or Japanese troops could be sent in after notifying the other country. For 2 decades, there was a standoff between China and Japan. But in 1894, the murder of a Korean in Shanghai and an uprising of peasants in Korea brought both Chinese and Japanese troops into the peninsula. Fighting between the two nations began almost immediately. The Japanese drove the Chinese out of Korea entirely. They also moved into Manchuria and were in a position to threaten Beijing. In a short period of time, the Chinese were defeated and called for peace. Peace was concluded on April 17, 1895, in the Shimonoseki Treaty. The treaty gave an indemnity to Japan, ended China's claims to control over Korea, and gave various lands to Japan, including Formosa, Taiwan. Taiwan remained a colony of Japan from 1895 to 1945, making Japan the world's first non-Western colonial power. The war showed that Japan now had a fully modern military capable of fighting a modern war. It also showed that Japan had a serious interest in the peninsula and the lands leading to Manchuria. 64. The Russo-Japanese War. Japan's victory in the First Sino-Japanese War was followed by another struggle for influence in Northeast Asia. The next struggle was with Russia. The Japanese expected to gain at least some of the territories it had conquered during the fighting. But in the Triple Intervention, Russia, Germany, and France, Japan was forced to return Manchuria's Liaodong Peninsula. Then Russia gained control over the peninsula. Tensions increased, and the Japanese launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur on February 8, 1904. Commander Togo Heihachiro bottled up the Russian fleet in Port Arthur. He destroyed it one ship at a time. The battles then began on land. Port Arthur was the heavily protected main base for Russia's Far East Navy. On January 1, 1905, after 6 months of fighting and 56,000 Japanese casualties, the Japanese army took the city. The casualties were heavy again in Japan's defeat of Russian troops at Mukden. Japan was winning, but its resources were seriously depleted. How much longer the Japanese could fight became questionable. The fighting once again returned to the sea. On May 27, 1905, Russia's Baltic Fleet reached Tsushima Strait on its way to Vladivostok. Admiral Togo attacked the fleet. With inferior numbers, Togo used tactical strength and the discipline of the sailors to defeat the Russians at what became known as the Battle of Tsushima. 65. The Portsmouth Treaty. Despite its victories, Japan decided to negotiate peace. The talks were held in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, with President Theodore Roosevelt as the mediator. The Portsmouth Treaty gave Japan the leases to Port Arthur and the Liaodong Peninsula, as well as the southern half of Sakhalin Island. It also gave recognition to Japan's interests in Korea. All foreign troops were to be withdrawn from Manchuria. The only exception allowed was the Japanese troops guarding the railroad that became the South Manchurian Railway. This last condition would become highly significant several decades later. There was one highly significant omission from the treaty. It did not provide for an indemnity. Japan would not receive money in compensation for granting peace to Russia. The Japanese public took to the streets in outrage. The Japanese government had not told them just how critical Japan's situation had been. It was hard for the people to understand why Japan had not received the expected compensation from Russia. The government's decision not to tell the public what was actually happening would be repeated in years to come. Domestic unrest resulted from the Portsmouth Treaty, but there was pride in having defeated a Western power. It was now evident that Japan was one of the top powers in the world. Japanese influence in Asia was now stronger than ever. Its only rival in East Asia now was the United States. 66. Annexation of Korea. Following Japanese victory against the Chinese in 1895, Japanese trade with the Korean peninsula increased. So did Japanese involvement in the political situation there. Before the declaration of war with Russia, Japan rushed troops to Korea. Japan managed to get the Korean government to agree to a protocol. This allowed the Japanese to launch operations against Russia on Korean soil. In return, Japan promised to guarantee the independence and territorial integrity of Korea. By 1905, Japan made Korea a protectorate. Japan exercised full control over Korea's relations with the rest of the world. The first resident general that Japan sent to Korea in December 1905 was Ito Hirobumi. It became his last career assignment. He arrived with control over the military as well as the civilian government. Ito was unable to apply the methods he had used in establishing the Meiji government to the strengthening of the Korean government. In the face of serious Korean resistance, he resigned this post in the summer of 1909. In autumn of that year, Ito was assassinated by a young Korean who had formed a guerrilla group to fight for Korean independence. In August 1910, a cabinet of Korean collaborators quietly signed a treaty that allowed Japan to completely annex Korea. The signing was not made known for a week in order to give Japan sufficient time to prepare for the Korean public's anticipated protests. 67. The High Treason Incident. Kotoku Shusui helped form Japan's first socialist party, the Socialist People's Party, Shakai Minshuto, in 1901. It was banned by the government within 2 days. He also published an attack on imperialism. With other socialists, he published the Heimin Shimbun, the Commoner's Press. In it, he published the first Japanese translation of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. Kotoku Shusui is best remembered for being involved in the high treason incident of 1910. It was an anarchist plot to assassinate the emperor. Kotoku was accused of being the leader of a nationwide group of left-wing activists and sympathizers in a conspiracy against the throne. According to one of the 26 who were arrested, the myth of the emperor was the main obstacle to the spread of socialism in Japan. Therefore, the best way to destroy the myth was to hurl a bomb at the imperial carriage to kill the emperor. Although there was evidence that Kotoku withdrew from the conspiracy in 1909, the government determined that he was at the center of the plot. In a secret trial, Kotoku and 11 co-conspirators were found guilty of treason and executed in 1911. The impact of this trial on Japanese leaders in and outside of government was enormous. The case involved not just political action, but also the freedom of ideas. The open intellectual environment of the early years of the Meiji period came to an end with the execution of Kotoku Shusui. Censorship and government control over ideas was on the increase. 68. The Road to War. Great Britain and Japan formed the Anglo-Japanese Alliance of 1902 for several reasons. First, they both had major navies. Second, they were both interested in using their powers in China. Third, they were both worried about Russian influence in the region. The alliance also pledged both nations to act together if Russia joined any country in actions against Great Britain or Japan. In the beginning, Great Britain was happy to not have to spend money to support its own navy in Asia. But by the 1910s, it appeared that Japan was using the treaty to expand its own influence in Asia. In fact, acting in the spirit of the alliance, on August 15, 1914, Japan issued an ultimatum to Germany. It demanded that Germany turn over its lease in China's Shandong Peninsula to Japan for eventual return to China. Germany did not do this, so Japan sent 60,000 troops into the peninsula. The Japanese easily expelled the Germans. From that point until 1922, Japan controlled former German mining, industrial, and commercial operations in the region. The Allied powers asked Japan to send Japanese troops to the European battlefields. However, Japan limited its military involvement to protecting convoys of Allied merchant ships. While the European countries were fighting in Europe, Japan took advantage of the opportunity to expand its Asian markets. It also extended its influence in China, Siberia, and the Pacific Islands. Japan became a major exporter of manufactured goods and war materials, transforming the country into a heavy industrial power. 69. Impact of the war. Particularly in relationship to China, during World War I, Japanese leaders thought it was a good opportunity to strengthen Japan's influence. Some of the leases that Japan held in Manchuria were scheduled to end in 1923. The competing European countries were busy fighting the war. In January 1915, the Japanese submitted a list of 21 demands to the Chinese government. These demands included recognition of Japan's control in Shandong Province, new leases in Inner Mongolia, and renewal of leases in Manchuria. They also included a demand that would make China a Japanese protectorate. This latter demand would include Japanese advisors in China's government ministries and require that China purchase armaments from Japan. Except for the latter demand, the Chinese government granted the remaining demands in 1915. This incident created widespread resentment in China and increased worldwide criticism of Japan. At home, Japanese sentiment seemed divided between a truly internationalist attitude, an ultranationalist attitude, and a pan-Asian attitude. One group called for cooperation with Western nations, and another called for joining with other Asian nations to free Asia from outside domination. Over time, the nationalists would join with the pan-Asian supporters against the Western powers. 70. Following the end of World War I. After the war, the leading powers gathered in Geneva in 1920 to form a peacekeeping organization called the League of Nations. The idea of the League was appealing, but to many Japanese, it was an organization which favored the West. The Japanese public also distrusted the major treaties that came from the Washington Conference of 1921. In the Four-Power Treaty, Great Britain, France, the United States, and Japan agreed to respect each other's interests in Northeast Asia. The agreement served as the basis for relations between Japan and Western nations until 1930 and the London Naval Conference. The Four-Power Treaty recognized Japan as the major military power in East Asia. It prevented other members from building new naval bases in the western part of the Pacific Ocean. This guaranteed Japan naval superiority in its surrounding waters. The Five-Power Treaty created a 5-to-5-to-3 ratio of capital ships for Great Britain, the United States, and Japan. The agreement signed at the Washington Conference confirmed Japan's cooperation with Western nations. They increased economic ties between Japan and the West. This helped Japan reduce military spending by providing security. However, many Japanese became unhappy with the agreements. Japanese nationalists felt that Japan had given up too much. They objected to the restrictive 5-to-5-to-3 limit on capital ships. They believed that this weakened Japan's special interests in Asia. By the end of the 1920s, some Japanese advocated a Japan-controlled economic region, including Manchuria, Mongolia, and coastal China. 71. Taisho democracy. The period from 1905 through 1932 is referred to as Taisho democracy. Beginning in this period, elected officials formed cabinets run by members of political parties. The political pendulum went back and forth between government by the elites and government by elected representatives. Some preferred an orthodox form of leadership, in which the Prime Minister and his cabinet made the decisions. Others wanted the House of Representatives to play a significant role in the making of political decisions. In 1918, when women in fishing villages began protesting the shipment of rice to the Osaka rice market, they triggered a national movement. Rice riots, strikes, and demonstrations broke out in the cities, targeting the police and the rich. Calls came for installing a political party cabinet, one responsive to the House of Representatives. The first effective party-based cabinet was formed later that year by Hara Takashi. Political parties had finally gained recognition as a legitimate element within national government. A second major step forward in Taisho democracy was the expansion of the electorate. Payment of tax was a necessary condition for gaining the right to vote. Therefore, rural property owners were represented more widely than those who had moved to cities to work in the factories and companies. These urban workers were most likely to join demonstrations and go on strike. Finally, the government in 1925 passed a law granting universal manhood suffrage, a major development. A feminist movement, launched during this same period by Hiratsuka Raicho and Ichikawa Fusae, called for female suffrage as well. The extension of the vote to women would not be realized until 1945. 72. The Great Kanto Earthquake. As fires were burning in charcoal and gas stoves at lunchtime on September 1, 1923, a major earthquake struck Tokyo and the surrounding region. Wooden buildings collapsed, stoves fell over, and fires started in the crowded neighborhoods of the city. Fanned by strong winds, fires swept through the eastern part of the city for 2 full days. Estimates of the victims and missing ranged from 100,000 to 200,000, and some 570,000 residences, roughly 75% of the city's total, were destroyed by either the quake itself or the following fires. The damage brought the city to a complete halt. 73. Rise of the military. The first attempt by right-wing military officers to force the government to change occurred in March 1931. In the so-called March Incident, Army officers and leading civilians were planning to attack the Diet, the headquarters of the political parties and the Prime Minister's residence. Their goal was to force the Prime Minister to resign and replace him with Ugaki Kazushige, the War Minister. The scheme to topple the government failed, but no one was punished. On September 18, 1931, members of the Japanese military carried out an act that brought about the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. Japanese military officers set off an explosion which damaged the tracks of the South Manchurian Railway near Mukden. The Japanese claimed that it was caused by Chinese troops. In order to protect Japanese citizens and property in the region, they occupied Mukden. Within days, additional troops from Korea poured into Manchuria. They did so without the permission of the Japanese government. With this initiative, the Japanese military stopped cooperating with the bureaucrats in Tokyo in determining foreign policy. From 1931 through 1945, the military and its supporters in government would determine Japanese policies. There were 2 larger repercussions. First, international opposition to Japanese military moves in Asia increased. Second, the military was taking an increasingly stronger role in government, both on the continent and in Japan itself. With a major assassination, the military would make a major step toward ending government by political parties. 74. February 26th Incident. A group of junior army officers decided to take action themselves. They were inspired by the samurai tradition that had led to the restoration of power to the emperor, and by an eagerness to create a stronger, more emperor-centered nation. With the tacit support of several senior military officials and 1,400 troops, they attempted a coup d'etat on February 26, 1936. They captured the Diet Building, the War Ministry, Tokyo Police Headquarters, and the Prime Minister's official residence. They assassinated the Finance Minister, Takahashi Korekiyo, and the brother-in-law of Prime Minister Okada Keisuke, who they mistook for the Prime Minister himself. The incident was a major crisis. Military leaders urged moderate treatment of the rebels, but the Showa emperor regarded the troops as traitors who should be crushed. On February 29th, the army surrounded the rebels and issued a demand: surrender or be suppressed. Most of the troops surrendered. Unlike earlier instances of unauthorized military action, these officers were dealt with severely. 19 of the leaders were sentenced to death, and others were sentenced to prison. The incident reined in some of the right-wing elements in the military, but it had the ironical effect of bringing the military even further into the government. The civilian government became even more aware of the fact that they depended on the military to maintain social stability. 75. War with China. On the night of July 7, 1937, a small group of Japanese soldiers were practicing maneuvers near the Marco Polo Bridge, Rokokyo, just outside Beijing. Shots were heard and a firefight erupted between Japanese and Chinese troops. There are a number of theories concerning what actually happened. Was it an accidental shot? Or was it a plot carried out by the Japanese, the Chinese, or someone else? It is difficult to determine what actually happened. However, this Marco Polo Bridge incident quickly escalated into full-scale war, the Second Sino-Japanese War. It lasted from 1937 until 1945 and became part of World War II. There is similar disagreement over what happened when the advancing Japanese army reached Nanjing, the capital of China, in December of that year. The Japanese took the city on December 13th and commenced to loot and burn the city and rape and kill residents and refugees who had fled there. This outrage continued until March of the following year. Following World War II, views of the Nanjing Massacre have varied widely. 76. Pearl Harbor and the Pacific War. Japan had entered hostilities in Asia with the Manchurian Incident in 1931. The China War, or the Second Sino-Japanese War, erupted in July 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge Incident. From that latter date, Japanese troops engaged in a full-scale war with China, taking Nanjing and most of the coastal area, but never succeeding in forcing China to surrender. To secure the northern border of China, Japan signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in April 1941. That relieved some pressure, but the United States began to apply different pressure on Japan's imperialist operations on the Asian continent step by step. First came the reduction of supplies and raw materials. Then came a trade embargo. Finally, the U.S. seized and froze all assets that the Japanese held in the U.S. Negotiations between the two nations stalled. Japan's leaders decided to make a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. They hoped to stun the Americans into calling for a negotiated settlement. The bombing of the American Pacific Fleet on December 7, 1941, and America's subsequent declaration of war brought forth a global war. Although the Japanese did not invade Hawaii, they dealt a serious blow to the American Navy's fleet there. Japan quickly pushed on, taking Guam, Wake, Hong Kong, the Malay Peninsula, Burma, Siam, and the Philippines. These comparatively easy victories provided a portion of the military's badly needed natural resources and supplies. They also raised expectations for further expansion. 77. Daily life under wartime conditions. By summer of 1942, Japanese military advances were no longer as successful. An American naval assault at Midway Island, northwest of Hawaii, resulted in a disastrous loss for the Japanese Navy. From this point forward, both sides suffered enormous losses, and the Americans steadily pushed the Japanese back across the Pacific. At Saipan, for example, the Americans suffered 15,000 casualties, but inflicted some 31,000 casualties on the Japanese before taking control of the island. The three-pronged American offense across the Northwest, Central, and Southwest Pacific regained the islands that Japan had taken over. When the Americans captured Guam in August 1944, they gained a base for launching bombing raids on the Japanese homeland. In October 1944, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur launched a 6-month campaign to take over the Philippines. On April 1st, the Americans commenced a brutal battle for Okinawa. In June 1944, the Allies began bombings of Japanese cities. On March 10, 1945, Allied planes dropped 2,000 tons of explosives and firebombs on Tokyo. In the firestorm that resulted, some 80,000 residents were killed. Food and supplies for Japan's military and ordinary citizens decreased rapidly. The military situation grew rapidly worse. However, the Japanese cabinet and its military leaders could not bring themselves to surrender. Not even an ultimatum from the Allies could force them to give in. 78. The Potsdam Declaration and End of the War. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin met at Yalta in February 1945. They discussed issues that would have a major impact on Japan. First, Stalin agreed that the Soviets would enter the ongoing war against Japan. The Allies agreed that they would support Soviet claims for the southern half of Sakhalin and the Kurils, and Soviet presence in Manchuria. Once the Allied powers achieved victory in Europe in the spring of 1945, they concentrated their efforts on ending war in the Far East. The last conference of the major Allied leaders took place between July and August 1945 in Potsdam, near Berlin. Truman, U.S., Stalin, USSR, and Churchill, UK, attended. On July 26, Truman, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek issued a declaration. It called on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face the possibility of utter destruction. The Japanese failed to respond to the Potsdam Declaration. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the world's first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, killing more than 100,000 people. On August 8th, the Soviet Union entered the war. On August 9th, the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The following day, Japan agreed to the terms of the Potsdam Declaration and surrendered. On August 15, 1945, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender to the people by radio broadcast. When he asked his people to endure the unendurable, many did not know what the words meant. Soon it became clear that Japan had not only surrendered, but had surrendered unconditionally.